Today we are joined by Erika Bornman and Daniel Schricker. Erika has carved a career for herself in magazine publishing as a writer and editor despite her lack of formal training. She first spoke out publicly about KwaSizabantu in a letter published in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1998, but it would be another 22 years before she became the catalyst for a major media exposé by Media24 called Exodus, published in September 2020. Her memoir, Mission of Malice, My Exodus from KwaSizabantu, was the recipient of the 2022 Diane Cassoni Award and is her first book and an important element in her ongoing quest to make the world a safer place for children. She lives in Cape Town, South Africa. Daniel is a composer and writer based in Adelaide, Australia. He completed his undergraduate and postgraduate studies at the University of Adelaide, where he was awarded a PhD in 2020. Alongside his doctoral research in music composition, he has developed academic interests in cults and fringe religious organizations. His recent writings delve into the theological and psychological aspects of high-control groups, and as a result, he has been invited as a guest on cult-focused podcasts in Australia, the UK, and South Africa. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Erika and Daniel.
Welcome to our presentation on pursuing justice in the time of COVID. KwaSizabantu as a case study. We're both childhood survivors of KwaSizabantu. I'm Erika, and I was at KwaSizabantu from age 9 to age 21. And Daniel was involved from the time he was born until the age of 17. I live in Cape Town, South Africa, and Daniel now lives in Adelaide, Australia. I want to just add a content warning here. We will be mentioning child abuse, sexual abuse, as well as psychological and spiritual abuse in this presentation. So we're going to look at what KwaSizabantu Mission is, as well as give an overview of the allegations against it and subsequent investigations. We'll delve a little deeper into the trauma, particularly children experience there, and its long-term impact. We'll have a brief look at the response of KwaSizabantu Mission in their depiction of survivors and the failure of the investigating bodies and South African authorities to date. Then, of course, there's the impact of COVID restrictions on the investigative procedures and the role social media has played in this ongoing saga. Then, with both of us having participated in one or more investigations against KwaSizabantu, we'll end with ethical considerations for the media and other organizations when dealing with survivors in investigative procedures.
KwaSizabantu is a mission station in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, founded in the late 1960s by an itinerant German-South African preacher, Erlo Stegen. Its inception was the result of an alleged religious revival which took place among the Zulus, in which the founder claimed that God manifested himself in a tangible way. It is also claimed that as a result of this revival, many miracles occurred, including multiple healings, exorcisms, and the resurrection of one of the group's leaders after it is alleged she passed away and went to heaven. KwaSizabantu grew to become one of the largest mission stations on the African continent and now houses a school, a training college for teachers, various agricultural pursuits, and a multi-million rand water company called Equele. The work eventually gained enough traction to plant churches in Europe, the US, and Australia, with thousands of followers being part of the KwaSizabantu network around the world. KwaSizabantu's history has never been without controversy, and among the allegations that have circulated for decades are child abuse, spiritual and psychological abuse, money laundering, covering up of sexual crimes, unethical employment policies, and cultic teachings and practices.
I escaped from KwaSizabantu in January 1993 at the age of 21. It took me a few years to realize what I'd experienced and witnessed was abuse and not God's will. In February 2000, I published an account of what had happened to me in a women's magazine called Femina. While there had been attempted interventions in the previous decades directly with KwaSizabantu's leadership, this marked the first time they had been outed as abusive in the mainstream media. I'd had letters published before, but nothing on this scale. The Sunday papers picked up on it, but the mission denied, and had congregants write letters to the papers to say how wonderful everything was. And the media soon lost interest. But the next month, in March 2000, a panel of evangelical leaders met to discuss KwaSizabantu. They also interviewed several ex-members, including me. KwaSizabantu rejected all their attempts at a meeting and announced on their website why they wouldn't participate. As a result, the panel made its report available publicly. They noted with concern the evidence of perceived abuse and wrongdoing on the part of the KwaSizabantu leadership, listing 9 elements: unbiblical teaching, the unbiblical role of fear, physical brutality, psychological abuse, the breaking of confidentiality, the splitting of families, including marriages, alleged untruths and deception, leadership's apparent protection of own ranks and even of alleged abuses, and the doctrine of exclusivity, KwaSizabantu practices presented as the way.
So for a while, everything went quite quiet on the investigations and the allegations into KwaSizabantu. And it wasn't until 2020 that News 24 in South Africa published an exposé called Exodus. And it was this that was responsible for finally bringing widespread public attention to the allegations of abuse at the mission. In addition to a feature-length documentary, News 24 released 4 podcast episodes and over a dozen news articles detailing allegations of cultic practices and abuse at KwaSizabantu. Since then, they have continued to cover the story. Among the key whistleblowers in this investigation were Erika Bornman, Dr. Schricker, Selempilo Malinga, and Manfred Stegen, who is the founder of Stegen. Here is the documentary from the trailer for the documentary, from News 24.
It was a very peaceful place.
The people were exceptionally open and friendly.
Our lives were socially, religiously, economically revolved around KwaSizabantu Mission.
You had to confess your sins regularly, at least once a week.
Then from there, you go to the hall where they cook for all the visitors.
You will see a whole lot of people that seem content and at peace, but that's just because they have to be.
Children were punished severely.
The fear of God was tangible. You could touch the fear of God.
I recall him then pressing my head into the grass. And I just recall feeling pain and feeling like I was going to die.
It was a house of horror.
It was such a friendly place. But now the mission has regressed into a full-time cult.
My first meeting with Adrian Basson, head of News 24, happened in February 2020. He immediately appointed a team of journalists to start investigating. But exactly 1 month later, South Africa went into lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This had a significant impact on the investigation as it curtailed in-person interviews significantly, especially in the early days of the pandemic. The News 24 team, however, did an amazing job. With only one cameraman present, they turned my home into a sound studio for the 4-episode podcast. It's well worth a listen. In 2021, it scooped top honors at the prestigious One World Media Awards in the United Kingdom. For the survivors, lockdown made it doubly difficult. I, for one, couldn't meet with friends for a debrief and a hug. Everything had to be done on Zoom or over calls. I felt extremely isolated and alone. More so as the team and I dug deeper into my past. I was instrumental in putting the journalists in touch with other survivors who I had to contact via email and on the phone. I recall 2020 as my year of tears. And if it weren't for the compassion of the journalists and the gentle way in which they dealt with me, I'm not sure we'd be where we are today.
In 2021, Erika released the most comprehensive autobiographical account to date, detailing life at KwaSizabantu. Mission of Malice documented not only the abuse she and many others suffered, but also examined some of the long-term effects. Last year, InfoCult awarded her the inaugural Diane Cassoni Award for her memoir.
Due to the media attention, the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities, a Chapter 9 institution mandated by our Constitution, and we're going to be referring to it as the CRL Rights Commission or just the Commission, they started investigating and documenting survivors' testimonies in October 2020, a month after Exodus was published. It soon became apparent to us that many survivors wouldn't be able to attend these hearings, except for when they were interviewed, except for when they interviewed Daniel and I. The rest of the hearings were all held in public. Many survivors told us they couldn't afford to take time off to travel to the city where the hearings were held. As a result, we gathered more than 70 detailed submissions from former members, most of whom had been children, to give to the Commission. The majority of these witnesses wished to remain anonymous for various reasons.
As a result of all of the media coverage, several other governmental bodies and departments vowed to investigate allegations of child abuse, unfair labor practices, and human rights abuses. And on your screen, you can see headlines showing just some of the different departments that were involved.
Let's have a look at what the investigations unearthed. At KwaSizabantu, physical abuse in the form of systemic beatings was a mission policy disguised as corporal punishment. The brutality far exceeded any normal discipline procedures. Survivors shared their experience of this abuse, detailing the pain and the resultant psychological trauma. These horrific punishments were not reserved for major offenses, but were given for trivial infractions. Stegen regularly preached that you have to break the spirit of a child by the age of 3. The entire philosophy underpinning the treatment of children was a sadistic dehumanization process in which the personality of the children was violently suppressed in order to bring them into conformity with the beliefs of the group.
On the screen, you can see a headline from a News 24 article that was released. And this article recounts the experience of a survivor and states the following. Bongani Sibisi, 40, was 12 years old when he asked one of his friends who had created God. This question earned him 35 lashes with a red pipe, which left him bloodied and labeled an antichrist. He cries bitterly as he speaks of this beating, allegedly at the hands of Michael Ngubani, now the chairperson of KwaSizabantu Mission's Domino Savite School Board and a director at Ekwele. Although 28 years have passed, he still has marks that he said he had sustained that day. Sibisi, at the time in his first year at the school, said Ngubani had summoned him after his friends had reported his question. He was taken to a room where he was instructed to remove his clothing and lie down on a table. He started to hit me with the red pipe. I was crying. There was even blood, but he kept hitting me, even when I faked fainting. He recalled that he was unable to sit after the beating. And when he was punished again days later after being caught playing with matches, his bottom had been so raw that the worker who beat him lashed him under his feet. Here is part of Erika's testimony at the hearings by the CRL Commission. She is reading a quote that was submitted by a former member describing their experience of physical, psychological, and spiritual abuse. This quote is really representative of the experience of many children who grew up at KwaSizabantu and is one of the 70+ testimonies Erika referred to earlier. We'll touch on this a bit later, but one of the disconcerting aspects of testifying via Zoom was that none of the members of the commission had their cameras switched on, and it meant that we were mostly speaking to a dark screen.
I will recall a defining moment in my life, which I will never forget. It demonstrates the type of psychological abuse I experienced, and it was the day my character was absolutely destroyed. I was howling in pain because each blow of the beating was so painful. I was hit all over my body, not just my bottoms. The co-worker kept saying that the beating will not stop until I ceased crying, for I was not allowed to utter a word while being beaten, like Jesus on the cross, apparently. Eventually, from exhaustion, I could no longer make any sounds, and I stopped crying out in pain. However, the hiding didn't stop. I was then informed, through the latter part of my hiding, that I am now going to be beaten because I am not showing any remorse for my actions. My spirit was broken that day, and I have never been the same again. My entire body shakes now when I recall that day. It might seem like physical abuse at first because it was a beating, but the damage is definitely a psychological one, not to mention my absolute fear of dying every night, my constant need to go to my counselor in case I were to die in my bed and burn in hell for eternity. I once stepped on a frog by accident one rainy day and was told by a teacher that I will not enter the gates of heaven because I am a murderer.
As mentioned earlier, these horrific punishments were not reserved for major offenses, but were meted out for trivial infractions. One survivor summarized the stringent rules which were accompanied by brutal punishments when broken. Then there were the endless rules. Anything that you can think of, there was a rule for it. And all these rules were loaded with a full retribution of God. Clothing, speaking, hair, facial hair, who not to talk to, greeting, praying, counseling, relationships, literature, music, etc. Many rules were unwritten. You only found out about them when you got into trouble.
So like many religious high control groups, KwaSizabantu has a history of sexual abuse allegations leveled against them. A number of these allegations were detailed in the Exodus documentary, but more victims of childhood sexual abuse emerged in the process of the investigations by the CRL Rights Commission. By compiling and comparing the various testimonies of sexual abuse survivors, it was possible to gain a clear picture of how this type of abuse occurred and how it was allowed to continue due to the failure of the leadership. The fact that sexual abuse occurred at KwaSizabantu is now beyond dispute. Even the leadership of the mission has conceded that sexual abuse of children did occur, though they have refused to accept any responsibility for these events and assigned blame only to individuals. When sexual abuse was reported to the leadership of the mission, not only was there a failure to report these crimes to law enforcement, but the victims were blamed and cast in the role of seducer. At least 3 witnesses, one being a minor at the time, have testified about Alo Stegen telling them not to tell anybody about this, not even their mothers. He then had them confess their sin of making a man of God stray and prayed to God to forgive them. The one-on-one counseling system, which is intrinsic to the mission's belief system, facilitated abuse as sexual predators were granted unsupervised access to women and children. The mission school's policy to perform virginity tests on the female students was a systemic violation of the girls' bodily autonomy, as consent was not required. Student risked expulsion from the school for failure to comply with this policy. So at the center of the mission's belief system is also this extreme paranoia surrounding sexuality. Genders are segregated completely, and no contact between men and women is allowed, even between engaged couples. The first time a couple are allowed to speak and interact is at the wedding ceremony. The inevitable result of this is a traumatic introduction to sexual experience, as the couple are alone for the first time on their wedding night.
This quote is from a testimony by former pupil Sponelo Tele, who was one of the main people behind gathering those 70+ testimonies. We are aware of, and in fact, they are victims of many instances of sexual abuse that happened at KwaSizabantu. These allegations came to my knowledge directly from victims who are afraid to have their ordeals known to the world and their children out of shame. In addition to the sexual violations' odious nature and the stigma it comes with, this fear is exacerbated by an oppressive response from KwaSizabantu authorities. When these crimes were reported to the mission leadership, they were covered up, or the victims themselves were blamed and expelled from the mission and/or the school. There are many more testimonies about rape and sexual assault available online. I personally know of 3 pedophiles KwaSizabantu protected despite knowing of their crimes. 2 were allowed to leave quietly and never faced the consequences of their actions, free to abuse wherever they went next. The third was allowed to live out his days on the compound, despite them knowing that he'd sodomized a 5-year-old girl. When confronted with his actions by a leader 10 years after the fact, he acknowledged what he'd done and expressed surprise that she remembered it as she'd been so little. He's dead now and buried at the mission.
A former pastor from KwaSizabantu, Pieter Becker, has confirmed this approach by the leadership. One newspaper article records that Becker told the commission of an instance where a co-worker was raped, but the matter was allegedly swept under the carpet. He said all he wanted from the commission was to make those responsible for the alleged abuse and distorting religion to be brought to justice.
KwaSizabantu implemented virginity testing of school-aged girls as a condition for attendance at the mission school. KwaSizabantu has attempted to defend its systemic virginity tests as being part of Zulu culture and that the parents demanded it, but a comparison to Zulu custom shows very little resemblance between the way KwaSizabantu did it and the way it's done traditionally. Also, there are many Zulu customs absolutely not allowed at the mission. And parents were not given a choice. They were told it was mandatory. Many survivors have indicated that significant feelings of fear, guilt, and shame accompanied the virginity tests, as no consent was required from the children and very little explanation was given to them. The girls had to queue after every school holiday, and their private parts were then inspected by 3 older women. And now we're going to bring you brave survivor Belimpilo Malinga, sharing the humiliating experience they endured 4 times a year on the Wide Awake podcast.
So was it only the black girls that were virginity tested?
Yes.
And can you tell us what that experience is like? And how often it happened?
Okay.
Start with a cue.
Before I start with the cue, I want to take you through the fact that my anatomy, I don't know my anatomy. So when they say, I just know that there's a private part that I must look after, and I must not let anybody touch. But there are 3 people that are going to touch my private part all at once, and they're going to look through it. And I'm thinking, why are you doing this? Or because we want to see if you have been tampered with. Who would have tampered with me? So you're starting to go through these questions, but you cannot really ask anybody about what this is all about. So what happens is when we come back from holidays, there's a place called the waiting room where we all line up. After breakfast, the girls would line up. Remember, this is okay, you wouldn't know. The waiting room is central. It's a central point. So the boys are going to either the school hall, or they're going on about their day. They will pass us sitting there, and they will start, making eyes and, laughing at us. And you're sitting there waiting in the queue. You don't know what these people are looking for. So you don't know whether they're going to find it or they're not going to find it. Finally, your turn comes. You get inside. There's these 3 women sitting there, and there's a bucket of water. They dip their hands in the water, then they touch you. They pull you. They ask you to take out your panties, and then they open you up and
they examine your vagina.
Yeah. And then what feels like 10 minutes, obviously it's not 10 minutes, but it feels like such a long time, people looking through. And then finally they say, okay, get up, dress up, and put on your panties, and then walk out. So nobody tells you what they're looking for. They don't tell you what they have found. They just let you go. And then there will be people who will be called after the whole exercise has been done, and the next thing you know, some people are leaving because they were found tampered with. Some people are being questioned.
So would they kick you out?
Yes. And after a while, you see them reintegrating with the group. Then you find out later that, okay, maybe they were found to have been tampered with, but how did they fix it? Because the next time we go through the similar thing, you think, okay, how are they going to know this time that if you had already been tampered with, how are they going to know that you were not tampered with this time around? So it was all confusing. It was not something that you could work out with your head.
And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but when done properly, it is done in a very loving way with the older woman of your family, and only after you've reached puberty. KwaSizabantu would have girls as young as 5 years old stand in that queue.
Everyone, the English class up to matric.
5 years old.
Yeah.
4 times a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me be clear. The preschool 5-year-old girls endured that along with everybody else.
Another source of trauma for many survivors was the strict gender segregation which KwaSizabantu practices. At the center of the group's religious worldview is an extreme paranoia concerning romantic feelings and sexuality. Dating and courtship are completely forbidden, and the genders are segregated. It is not permissible to date, speak to, or message a member of the opposite sex. Marriage occurs via one of the leaders of the mission, who proposes on behalf of the groom. The engaged couple remain separate until the wedding day and are not allowed contact until that time. As a result of this aspect of their belief system, couples' first sexual experience was often a highly traumatic event, as the consummation of the marriage effectively occurs between two strangers. The first quote on your screen comes from a woman, and the second is from a man, and they're both describing how they felt about sex after marriage. So the man says, after having sex, the woman says, after having sex in those beginning years, there were feelings of being used, like someone had helped himself to something he had no right to. And it was strange because I thought we were doing the right thing. And the male survivor says the following: I had never even kissed a girl before, and suddenly I was in bed with someone. It was incredibly traumatic. I would say we had tried to have sex, but it took a few weeks for us to get it right. While, of course, the biological urges are strong, I felt uncomfortable with what we were doing for years, even after 3 children. Intellectually, I knew it was nothing wrong, but psychologically, sex was sin.
Spiritual trauma at KwaSizabantu includes fear of sin, leading to scrupulosity. And honestly, sin could be something as just feeling a slight irritation or looking at a boy for a girl and admiring him. Then there's the fear of a vengeful and angry God, and the fear of eternal torment in hell, fear of being left behind in the rapture as well.
A particularly unique aspect of KwaSizabantu's theology is that they believe and teach that every single time a person sins, they are in danger of God's judgment and hell until the sin is confessed to one of the leaders of the group. This leads to an intense scrupulosity, as demonstrated in the testimony of these children. And this video is actually taken from KwaSizabantu's YouTube channel, and it was published in 2021.
And also another topic is, if we remember what we did wrong, you must not just leave it. Nesenye ihloko, ukukhumbula into oyenzile akufanele uyishiye nje kanjalo. But run to your mother or father, because if you don't do that, you might die and go to hell. Good. And the Lord taught me that if I ever remember something I've done wrong that's not right, I should always go as quick as possible to my counselor.
That video clip, that's what Daniel and I believed with all our hearts too. And that's a big reason why we do what we do. There are children growing up there still. By the way, the language you heard there is isiZulu. Most sermons are translated from English into Zulu and vice versa. Former member Isaac Duprier describes how this fear impacted him at the age of 5. I grew up at KwaSizabantu in terror without realizing at the time how abnormal it was. The beatings, terrifying as they were, paled in comparison to the psychological abuse. I remember at age 5 hurrying to the window early every morning and looking at the sky, dreading that Judgment Day might have arrived and caught me with some unconfessed sin in my heart, which sin was defined by KwaSizabantu's leadership in a way that would essentially ensure that everyone always had some.
Peter Becker, who I referred to a little bit earlier in the presentation, says that children at KwaSizabantu experience a God who is hard without mercy, a cruel God, while another survivor describes an unhealthy, soul-destroying fear of God. The fear of God I refer to is not at all the reverent and respectful fear of the Lord that the Bible talks of, but an unhealthy, soul-destroying fear based on a portrayal and depiction by KwaSizabantu of an angry God who is eagerly waiting to condemn you to eternal damnation. You grew up being convinced that you would be damned to hell if you set one foot wrong, even by mistake. There was, for all intents and purposes, no grace, no love, no compassion, and no mercy in their preaching and teaching.
A large part of the fear of God is the fear of hell. In KwaSizabantu's theology, this is eternal conscious torment in literal hellfire. Estes Perkel's The Burning Hell was shown repeatedly to children with no regard to age restrictions to instill a fear of hell. Children were subjected to other movies depicting violence and torture. Among the commonly shown movies at their youth conferences, with no regard to age restriction, was Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ as well. Punishments were often public and included forcing children to kneel on pavements in public places, forcing them to stand in front of the school during assembly, and forcing them to wear humiliating signs around their necks. I remember when I was still at school, watching one young boy, and I think he was maybe 4 or 5 years old. Well, he would have been at least 5, I guess. He would have been 5 years old. And he was made to stand in front of the school during assembly on the stage. And I remember he wet his pants, and they made him stand there the entire assembly. That humiliation, I don't know. Then, of course, there's the fear of self. As children, we were made to fear our own emotions, our own critical thinking. There's no such thing as critical thinking allowed, actually. And of course, we were made to fear our sexuality.
One former member, Otto de Vries, describes what happened when he had what others would consider a normal adolescent crush on a girl. And he says the following: with regards to having feelings for someone when you start becoming a teenager, you feel bad and you feel that it's the worst thing, the worst sin you've done when you have feelings for someone and you have a crush on someone. You've got to go see a counselor and you tell the counselor, I like this girl. And the counselor will say, do you have a relationship with her? And you say, no, I like the girl. And then he'll pray because it's the biggest sin that you can have. And that's all you know growing up.
KwaSizabantu intentionally eradicates strong social bonds between children, as they are forced to snitch on each other, even if they observed another child breaking one of the rules. This is still in the school's code of conduct under expected behavior. Exposure of irregular behavior just before the entry that reads, admit a fault before exposure. So the race is on. Are you going to admit before someone else tattletales on you, or are you going to wait until they do? KwaSizabantu was touted as a multiracial utopia. The first 35 years of its existence was during apartheid. And I know that was one of the elements that attracted people like my dad to the place, the idea that there was true equality regardless of race. However, there was a marked disparity in the treatment of Zulu children compared to the white children, the adults too, for that matter. As horrific as my childhood was, I still had it easy compared to my Zulu peers. I believe to this day KwaSizabantu is deeply racist. In its almost 60 years of existence, there has not been one interracial marriage. KwaSizabantu, like many high-control groups, practices shunning of everyone who leaves. People are forced to shun any family members who leave the mission, as they are regarded as apostate.
So the quote on your screen is from a former member, and she's describing some of the social divide that takes place. And she says this: we never had any real contact with my extended family, as none of them went to KwaSizabantu Mission. They were deemed to be heathens, and we had to keep away from them. If a person left the mission, they were referred to as having fallen and having backslid, and we were not allowed to talk to or see that person again. Leaving the mission wasn't just turning your back on it, it was turning your back on God. So in this section, we're going to be discussing the long-term impact of this childhood trauma experienced at KwaSizabantu and how this manifests in adulthood, specifically through feelings of fear and anxiety, rejection of belief in God, and suicidal thoughts and attempts. Additionally, we'll also be discussing some of the ways this affected people's view of sexual intimacy and also caused them to have low self-esteem, issues with anger, and dealing with imposter syndrome. The 70+ testimonies Erika and the others gathered contains heartbreaking accounts of people now in their 40s and 50s who are still paralyzed by their experience at KwaSizabantu.
Tabitha van Eden admitted that at the age of 30, she still sometimes wets her bed. As an adult, she says her anxiety, depression, and borderline personality disorder are a direct result of her hellish childhood at KwaSizabantu. She recalls her parents beating her for weeks at the age of 5 after she'd been sexually molested by an older boy. The boy's parents had also beaten her, warning her not to do it again. She was told she must have done something to provoke the boy sexually assaulting her. She ran away in the middle of the night at age 21 and says of life outside the mission, "You have to deal with the guilt. You have so much freedom, but you carry so much pain. It's uncharted waters. You are so naive." Tabitha accuses the mission of stunting its members' growth so that you cannot function in the outside world. That's the hardest part. These people do so much damage to us as children, they don't want to deal with the mess. They didn't teach us about life because they expected us to just live there forever. They wire your brain like they want to. Then it's a process of undoing all that.
It will come as no surprise that speaking out in the pursuit of justice came at a significant personal psychological cost for survivors, especially those who had experienced the aforementioned childhood trauma at KwaSizabantu. So one of the difficulties with this was obviously just reliving the childhood trauma and repressed memories, as this is fraught with a certain amount of risk. And some of the symptoms that survivors reported dealing with during this whole process included things like insomnia, anxiety, and depression. And a particularly large factor in determining the severity of trauma resurfacing was the extent of the ethical considerations by media outlets in using trauma-informed approaches to survivors. So on the screen, you'll see a comparison chart which compares two news outlets in South Africa, News 24 and Newsweek. And these are two media platforms that cover the KwaSizabantu story with radically different approaches to the ethical considerations. On the left, you'll see some of the features of News 24's media coverage. They conducted interviews with survivors. They allowed KwaSizabantu to share their side. They showed care and compassion, required affidavits and police reports for rape cases, and avoided sensationalism. On the right, you can see we've listed some of the problems with Newsweek's coverage. They used sensationalistic headlines, demeaning images, failed to engage with survivors, used speculative hypotheticals to cast doubt, and employed inflammatory language and biased reporting. Survivors have spoken about how affirming it was to be believed by News 24 and how sensitively their stories of trauma were handled. In contrast, there was a significant backlash to the Newsweek story, specifically their biased reporting and inflammatory language to discredit survivors, and in particular, one headline which depicted the pursuit of justice as an act of rape. Interestingly, Newsweek has gone out of business as it lost a major libel case shortly after the publication of their articles on KwaSizabantu. One recurring theme with cults who are exposed for abuse is their tendency to employ the features sometimes summarized by the DAVO acronym, and this was certainly the case with KwaSizabantu. This next section that we're going to be talking through will demonstrate just some of the different ways that the group's leadership responded to the survivor testimonies, including the outright denial of the allegations and various ways in which they attempted to paint themselves as the victims by attacking the integrity of the survivors who were speaking out. So initially, KwaSizabantu denied all of the allegations outright. So in their minds, and what they stated publicly was that this was a smear campaign, and they issued a public statement denying any wrongdoing. And on the screen, you'll see just two relevant quotes. So the first one, in the news, KwaSizabantu has broadly denied that it is a cult, saying the allegations leveled against it and its leaders are part of a smear campaign. It says it has done nothing wrong. And then a spokesperson for KwaSizabantu said the following: "What we are clear on is that the mission was never complicit. It never condoned evils."
But then, after more evidence surfaced, which made denial untenable for the leadership of KwaSizabantu, they switched tactics and attacked the integrity of the survivors speaking out. Here is Dr. Albie van Eerden, the father of the Tabita we mentioned earlier, the man who beat his own 5-year-old daughter for being sexually molested.
Friends, can I tell you a secret? The main reason why people have been attacking this work is because Judas, the ultimate Judas, Satan, has convinced them that there's not enough good being done in the right places.
Well, part of the attack came from my own mother. In one of the rare instances where a woman is allowed to preach from the pulpit, my mother held an entire sermon about me and how I allowed the root of bitterness to take hold, and it sprouted forth in the media as outright lies. KwaSizabantu broadcast this video on their YouTube channel days before the launch of News 24's Exodus. They, of course, had been given the right to reply with a detailed list of allegations against them. Just for some history, my mother disowned me and my brother in 1996 after we refused to acknowledge Elo Stegen as our spiritual leader. She claims I decided to shun them when I turned my back on God, and she now also denies disowning me. My brother was present for that conversation, however, and he also recalls her saying that we are no longer her children. She went on to write a book about biblical widowhood, in which she describes my brother as the living dead. And then she sent us each a copy of that book. Here's my mother.
And that can happen, and that happened also to this younger daughter of mine, this youngest daughter, when she left. And this bitterness grew and grew and grew. It doesn't matter now what comes from her mouth about this place of God.
Lokho kungenzeka futhi kwenzekile kule ndodakazi encane ngesikhathi ihamba ishiya kwakhula akusasho lutho kuyona nje ukuthi ikhiphani ngomlomo ngale ndawo kaNkulunkulu.
And that is what is so such a fearful thing. That a person that could have experienced all the beauty, all the kindness, all the blessing, all the mercy of God here at the mission can leave and speak bitter words.
Kodwa kuyinto esabekayo ebuhlungu ukuthi umuntu obengathola izibusiso athole ukuhlangana noNkulunkulu, athole konke okuhle kukaNkulunkulu la emishini, kodwa ahambe akhulume ngokubaba ngobumuncu.
And in these days it is so sad that one hears so many bitter things that have the power of the lie within it.
Kulezi insuku kuyadumaza ukuthi sizwe izinto eziningi ezibabayo ezinamandla amanga phakathi kuzona.
Because the truth flees before bitterness.
Ngoba iqiniso phela liyakubalekela ukubaba.
Truth and bitterness do not go together.
Iqiniso nokubaba akuhambisani.
And the fear of God and bitterness do not go together.
Ukumesaba uNkulunkulu nokubaba akuhambisani.
And that is what is such a sad matter, where people like my daughter leave and then they color everything in with these lies of bitterness and present it to many and defile many.
Perhaps the most insidious response on the part of KwaSizabantu's leadership was the attempt to cast themselves as the victims and to attack the moral integrity of the survivors who spoke out, as you've seen in that rather emotional snippet just then, even if it was their own family members. And on the screen here, you'll see the opening of a press release issued by KwaSizabantu, which came as a response to News 24's exposure. Due to the initial reduction in their profits, they claimed that their water company, Equele, was the real victim. And despite more and more people emerging to corroborate the allegations of abuse, KwaSizabantu dismissed them as being vague and suggested that they were simply a machine gun attack on an innocent organization. They further claimed that the survivors were unprincipled and suggested that they were acting out of expediency.
As the evidence mounted, KwaSizabantu issued a limp statement that said they regret if anyone was hurt. It goes against their values. And they asked victims of abuse at the mission to come forward and assist KwaSizabantu's own so-called independent investigation so that there could be reconciliation. But KwaSizabantu's denial and attacks and this apology that wasn't actually an apology unearthed significant trauma for survivors. Whistleblower Dr. Schricker described the fallout in the following way. During the early hours of Monday morning, I received a message on our family WhatsApp group. I was still sleeping. It was strange because our adult children know we go to bed early. I woke up to the message. It was from Marcus, our 40-year-old son. He is a successful business in Namaqualand, Namibia. His voice was breaking as he told us about the physical beatings he had endured at the KwaSizabantu Mission as a child. Not from me or his mother or grandparents, but from workers at the mission. He revealed to us how they had to strip down in their underpants, lie on the floor, and were furiously attacked for simple failures. On Friday morning, I was overwhelmed by calls and messages from people all over the country about the apology delivered by Ruth Kombrink on behalf of KwaSizabantu on Thursday. Kombrink is one of Alo Stegen's daughters and the general manager of Equele Water. After hearing her so-called apology, people were overcome by emotion, not because of the actual apology at last, but because of the farcical nature of Ruth's statement. I call it window dressing to impress Woolworths, Massmart, and others to resume business as usual. KwaSizabantu just wants the money taps to open again. And that is because after the first allegations came out, the major retailers in South Africa stopped stocking Equele water. But then a few months later, Equele water was back on the shelf.
In speaking with the survivors, the general consensus was a sense of despondency as they felt the investigating bodies had failed them. This included the two lawyers which KwaSizabantu appointed and touted as an independent panel, and the CRL Rights Commission. But there was an investigation into the KwaSizabantu branch in Switzerland that got to the truth of the matter. And we also found out that there's at least one person in government in South Africa who is seeking the truth. So I've already alluded to the main problem with the so-called independent panel who KwaSizabantu employed to investigate, and that is the problem of bias. As they were selected and paid for by KwaSizabantu, it cast significant doubt on the objectivity of their investigation. Ultimately, these fears were confirmed as the panel minimized and misrepresented many aspects of the abuse. Another problem was that the disclosing of survivors' personal and sensitive information to the public without their permission. In some cases, this included facts relating to sexual abuse. Despite these rather obvious problems, KwaSizabantu's lawyer used the report to claim exoneration and to vilify survivors despite evidence of significant problems within the mission's leadership. As the lawyer's statement was issued publicly in a YouTube video, the psychological impact on the survivors was significant as they had their personal information shared publicly without their consent.
Against my better judgment, I had spoken to the two lawyers appointed by KwaSizabantu. I was persuaded to do so because the argument was that how can we say it was a whitewash if we didn't at least try? Well, I'm only one of the people who had personal, sensitive information disclosed publicly. They told me my sister maintained my mother gave me sex education at the age of 10. I rebuffed that by telling them about an extremely traumatic medical visit in which I discovered I have a cavity in which someone's fingers can go. They put this in their report. And I tweeted, as a result of them going public with the report, this is what I tweeted. I wonder how many billable hours they spent on my private parts and my first visit to a gynae, and the fact that my mother denies I was anorexic, yet they have the gall to say they don't believe my understanding of my own anatomy. I didn't realize they were going to release those intimate details to the entire world. I feel violated all over again. Thank you, Peter Lemotier and advocate Kumbushazi, for teaching me that organizations can conquer humanity when they pay enough. Shame on you. In the report, they also say I advised a young woman to lie about being raped. They, of course, can present no evidence of that. And if I had the money, I would sue them for defamation. It is such a blatant lie. But like so many KwaSizabantu survivors, I don't have the money. While they were thriving, I was simply trying to survive. And that's not a recipe for growing wealth. This report left us disheartened and feeling completely hoodwinked. It was absolutely devastating to talk to other survivors afterwards and hear their pain and disillusionment. And it was an enormous setback for many of us in our healing journeys. Many of the survivors who spoke to these two lawyers gave up the fight completely after the sham of a report was published. But the one thing KwaSizabantu didn't manage to kill off is our sense of humor. Here's a former member's take on the so-called independent report and its findings. Regarding the cult allegation, the report seems to say that it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, but nonetheless concludes that it simply ain't a duck because those looking, walking, and quacking like ducks claim they are not ducks.
So now we get to some of the problems with the report by the CRL Rights Commission. In early 2023, in response to a witness threatening to take them to court to force them to release the report, the Commission promised to release it on the 31st of March. But on that date, they actually sent a confidential draft report for comment to KwaSizabantu itself, and one lawyer representing some of the witnesses asking for comment and promising their final report on the 5th of May. They failed to do that, and at the time of this recording, we only have their draft report. So some of the other issues in terms of the testimonies themselves was more to do with the ethical considerations by the CRL Commission. So for example, the CRL testimonies of the survivors were live streamed without prior consent. But in contrast to this, when KwaSizabantu's leadership was asked to appear, they were granted privacy in their session. And this became even more problematic when the mission used one of these live streams of a survivor's testimony to file a lawsuit against him. Another big issue was the fact that the CRL Commission disallowed key testimonies compiled from more than 70 witnesses, despite repeated efforts by Erika to submit them. There was also a 2.5-year delay in releasing the report, with minimal updates provided to survivors who testified. And perhaps most disappointing was the fact that the draft report is a complete whitewashing and dismissal of most of the abuse, including the beating of children and the virginity testing, as it was deemed to have occurred many years ago. The language contained in the draft is used to downplay the severity of the abuse as well. For example, horrific beatings, like the ones we've shown you just a couple of examples of, are deemed legal as they are described as corporal punishment in the report. And to really add insult to injury, the Commission's finding included recommendations for survivors to be reconciled to the organization that abused them.
Many survivors, including me, had seen the CRL Rights Commission as our only hope of ever receiving some kind of justice for the abuse we endured as children. You heard from Kalimpilo Malinga earlier, and here's what she said in late 2021 already about the Commission's inaction and lack of communication with witnesses. The testimony ripped open our wounds, and the Commission's inaction means those wounds are still open. Nobody has dressed or bandaged them. The Commission is leaving our wounds open to fester. We'll be able to provide an update of where this report is at and what steps we've taken since during the live Q&A session after this presentation, so do join us for that.
The findings of the Swiss investigation into KwaSizabantu over in Europe are in line with the allegations made by numerous victims who've reported the physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse. The report finds many victims have suffered long-lasting scars, mental distress, and physical damage due to the practices of the mission school. It's also worth noting that the former Swiss KwaSizabantu branch had also dismissed all allegations of abuse for over 2 decades, just like the mission headquarters in South Africa. The Swiss boarding school, Domino Civite, has since been closed. However, in contrast to Mission KwaSizabantu South Africa, the former KwaSizabantu community in Switzerland has acknowledged the injustice committed for years, issued an apology, and promised financial aid to the victims to pay for therapy to help them heal from the traumas that they suffered.
Until we saw the draft of the CRL Rights Commission's report on 31 March 2023, we were completely unaware that there was someone in the government of KwaZulu-Natal who had recommended a commission of inquiry. KwaZulu-Natal is the province in which KwaSizabantu is situated. From the contents of this document, it is clear that it was written in late 2020. However, the then Premier of KZN, Zihle Zikalala, is a staunch supporter of KwaSizabantu, so it's not surprising that none of us even knew of this recommendation, nor is it at all surprising that no commission of inquiry was ever established. Zikalala was appointed as South Africa's Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure in March this year, so he's now a member of our cabinet. We mean it when we say KwaSizabantu has friends in high places, and he is far from the only one. We will, of course, follow up on this now and demand some answers. But let's look at some of what the Chief Director of Stakeholder Management in the Office of the Premier said. It mentions the need for a centralized approach by different entities because KwaSizabantu Mission has an arsenal of legal and financial resources. And among the many recommendations, these ones stand out in particular. Investigate the Orania-type self-governing territory. Now, for those of you who don't know, Orania is a section of South Africa where the right-wing the white supremacist Afrikaners have built themselves an enclave where they basically rule themselves. Investigate unfair labor practices, afford individuals a platform to answer allegations in their personal capacity, and conduct structured psychological counseling for the alleged victims. The document ends by strongly recommending the establishment of a KZN Commission of Inquiry with wider terms of reference to provide clearer and enforceable recommendations. And that, of course, never happened.
The fact that these investigations into KwaSizabantu took place during the COVID pandemic brought a number of unique challenges for the survivors. First and foremost, the lockdowns which accompanied the COVID restrictions meant that survivors were even more isolated at a time when social connection and support was crucial. The second round of hearings was done via Zoom rather than in person due to these restrictions. And as we've mentioned earlier as well, this presented some challenges as well in terms of survivors having to speak to a black screen while sharing very difficult and personal stories of trauma and abuse. And the other issue that was influenced by the COVID pandemic was that some of the delays that were the result of this were partly responsible for the 2 years that it took for the CRL Rights Commission to release the report.
Yeah, by the time that March 2022 rolled around, you'd think I'd be used to speaking to the screen instead of people. But I was intensely nervous when the CRL Rights Commission finally called me to give my testimony. I'd written to them often about the 70+ testimonies we had gathered. They never bothered to respond. And so I prepared my testimony by quoting from a compilation of these testimonies. As you're going to see, they stopped me and told me I may not talk about anyone else's experience as my and only my own. And this, coupled with the black screen I was facing, had me break down. I can tell you, I felt like such a failure. And it's only now in preparing this presentation that I went back to watch myself and I realized I didn't actually do such a bad job after all. However, something as simple as allowing me to see a few faces would have significantly reduced my trauma.
Name redacted used to force us to confess sins we did not do, and she would emotionally blackmail us to confess. Another person?
Erika.
Sorry, yes.
And I'm just, because you are reading what other people have said.
Yes.
I thought the focus is on what your experience has been, and that the people who you are trying to read their stories, if they want to approach us, they will do so. And if they want their names not to be reflected, we will do so. But I thought today we are concerned about yourself.
Right.
Precisely your experience.
Apologies for that. I have written numerous emails to the Commission about this matter. I asked, what should I do with these testimonies? I've requested that information more than once. I was never responded to about what I need to do with these testimonies. And so because I had informed the Commission that I had all these testimonies, and also on Monday I expressed my desire to share some of these testimonies with the Commission. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. It would be so nice if somebody could just show their face. Oh, there's Chris. Because I feel like I'm speaking to this black screen and I'm not seeing anyone, and that makes it a little bit difficult. I'm okay. I'm just crying. Don't worry.
Yeah. Yeah, that was hectic. But hey, there's social media. And social media played a large role in the response to the investigations, both by the public, but also by KwaSizabantu's leadership. So there were calls for boycotts of Ekwele products, and those calls became more and more widespread as social media is used to bring the abuse at KwaSizabantu to wider public attention. Just the other day, I saw on Twitter, somebody said, so which companies do you guys boycott? And it was very heartening to see how many people responded, Ekwele. As mentioned earlier, KwaSizabantu uses their YouTube live streams of their Sunday services to attempt to discredit us survivors. And they also upload interviews of current members to their website and YouTube channel in order to try and prove that they are not a cult. And actually, how cultish is that? I have to give huge kudos to Daniel, because he posts problematic clips from their sermons on Twitter, and that kind of forces KwaSizabantu to then the next week respond publicly to some of them. And so social media has become useful in forcing accountability and not allowing the leadership of KwaSizabantu to control the narrative entirely. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you listening to us right now. Online communities have truly been a game changer for people like us who've managed to get out of cults. And thanks to social media, we can now link up with others from around the world who have been in our shoes, offering a shoulder to lean on and a shared understanding of our unique experiences. And hashtags like #IGotOut does an amazing job at bringing people together, as does the #IGotOut organization, of course. And it's not only about connecting, it's also about learning and healing. With organizations like ICSA and InfoCult, survivors have access to a treasure trove of resources that help them on their journey to recovery. And let's not forget their loved ones. These online spaces give them insights and tips on how to provide the best support as well. But perhaps one of the coolest things about this community is how it's become a megaphone for survivors to raise awareness about cult activities and push for changes that protect others. In a nutshell, this community is a lifeline, a rallying point, and a hub for change. And I am deeply honored to be part of it.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and just a final few closing remarks. So in terms of where things are at currently with the investigations, despite overwhelming evidence of physical, sexual, psychological, and spiritual abuse, the independent panel, the CRL Rights Commission, and the government have essentially chosen to look the other way. KwaSizabantu continues to host large conferences with evangelical ministers from around South Africa, despite the significant media exposure of the abuse. The leadership of KwaSizabantu continue to claim innocence of all charges, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and continue to label all criticism as a satanic attack. In the Q&A that follows, we'll hopefully be able to answer more questions on where things are at currently. As we bring this presentation to a close, I'd just like to leave with a few final reflections of things we've learned from this entire process. So beginning with just the fact that it highlighted the importance of trauma-informed processes and interviews when dealing with survivors of cults. And along with this is also the importance of respecting the privacy of survivors and their stories to ensure that the cult cannot use testimonies to file lawsuits, ensuring that consent is given before survivor testimonies are released into the public domain, and ensuring that contact is maintained with survivors during investigative processes, particularly if the time frame stretches across several years, like it did in this particular case. One question we'd like to leave you with: is it more important to seek justice for survivors and punishment for abusers, or should the focus be on providing resources to help current members leave? And so with that, that's the end of our presentation, and we very much hope that you'll join us for the Q&A, where we'll hopefully be able to provide a few more updates and answer any questions you might have.